speak to you in the name of God, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but I love what Paul says. I speak to you in human terms because of your natural limitations. That's not nearly as nice, is it? I speak to you actually in slightly geeky and nerdy terms. I realized as I was putting this homily together that it was both geeky and nerdy. So I hope that we learned something today, but hang in there with me. And it's geeky because I begin by describing one of my sort of television habits, which is at night, sometimes we like to watch CNBC because they do reruns of TV shows, and I'm a big Shark Tank fan. But one of my latest interests is a show called The Prophet. Have you seen this? Where a gentleman named Marcus Lemonis goes in and he flips businesses. And my favorite part about this show is that he goes into the business and the conversation usually goes like this. He says, well, let me see your books. And they say, well, we don't really have books. And he says, well, that's not a very good way to run a business. And they say, well, it's really worked for us. And he says, but not really, your business is tanking. And they say, well, who are you to bring that up? And he says, well, you're the one who called my show and told me to come help you. And they go, well, we don't know if we need your help. So the first half of every episode is them arguing with him. And sometimes it goes almost the whole episode where he's telling them, this is not any way to run a business. And they are fighting with him. I've never seen one of these shows where they give in and go, you know what? You're so right. We have been looking for this advice all along. We'll change everything. You just tell us what we need. Inherently, every episode, they fight him. There's pride in it. There's pride in the way they work. And also, I think, a reluctance to do the hard work that's required to change. And so the hallmark of the show is not only that he flips the business, he always does. In the end, the business turns around. But only when the people that he is nagging at come to the terms that it's really up to them to hear the words that he's telling them to do and to actually go and do it. And this is a formula that's worked for other shows. I understand there's like the restaurant one and there's a bar one. It's made for a good theme. But The Prophet is interesting, I think, because of its name. And it's called The Prophet. It's spelled Profit. So hint, it's about money. But it's definitely a play on words, right? That he comes in and he delivers the hard message. And the folks there who have the tanking business have to wrestle with whether or not to hear that message. Geeky tee up, right? But it helps us understand the biblical prophets. And today we've got two references to the biblical prophets. First in the reading from Jeremiah, but also in Jesus's comment in Matthew that you would receive a prophet's reward. And Jeremiah is perhaps the best example. Well, there's many good examples, but he's the one I'm thinking of today because his reading was in front of us. One of the things that prophets all have in common, biblical prophets, is several things. One, they delivered a hard message. Two, they delivered that message out of love for the people and out of honor to God. It wasn't self-serving messages. They were, in some ways, very selfless in the work that they did. But they did it. They did a hard message, and they did so in compassion for the people and in honor of God. And three, this is sort of a no-brainer, but all of the prophets that we keep in the Bible are prophets whose prophecies came true. Like I said, kind of a no-brainer because it would be weird if we kept one that totally went in a different direction. So those are kind of the three distinguishing marks of a biblical prophet. And I mentioned Jeremiah because I think he's particularly interesting to me, but also interesting because of the time in which he's preaching. And of course, he shows up in our lectionary today. Jeremiah is often referred to as the weeping prophet because so much of his book, and it is long, is filled with lamentations for the people. I told you it was nerdy. You had the geeky part, now you get the nerdy part. If we remember the history of the Jewish people, about 3,000 years ago, so 1000 BC, King David takes the city of Jerusalem, builds that as the capital of the Jewish people. Solomon, his son, builds the first temple. That temple thrives for several hundred years. But in the 6th century BC, so we're talking 500s, the Babylonians come in a series of invasions from the north down from Syria, and they chip away at the northern territory, which was called Samaria, and eventually they make it into Judea, where the city of Jerusalem was. And they take all the Israelites, and they either, many of them die, many of them go into exile in Babylon, which is sort of modern day Iraq. Jeremiah's prophecy is coming at the end of Jerusalem's being. He is seeing the Babylonians come from the north. He is seeing raid after raid, invasion after invasion. And more importantly, he is seeing the people in Jerusalem not responding to this. The king, Jehoiakim, is not a fan of Jeremiah. And the people don't have any real sense of allegiance to God. They're all kind of fending for themselves. And so Jeremiah's prophecy is foreseeing the destruction of Jerusalem. And we know, of course, that the city is eventually taken by the Babylonians, and the temple is destroyed. And the artifacts of the temple disappear. They disappear. The Ark of the Covenant disappears, only until it's found in the 1930s by an archaeologist from Yale named Indiana Jones. I'm just seeing if you're awake. Indiana Jones did not find the Ark of the Covenant. Don't tell anybody I said that. So Jeremiah's prophecy is coming at a time in which everything is beginning to collapse on the Jewish people. And they are not attuned to that message. Jehoiakim is particularly an interesting character. Our early understanding of this is that Jeremiah would present his letters, his warnings to Jehoiakim. And Jehoiakim would sit there and he would take a knife and slice off verse after verse of Jeremiah's letters and throw them in the fire. Throw them in the fire. He wouldn't even read it. He would just cut it, throw it in the fire. His fire burned because of Jeremiah's letters. So much so that Jeremiah was eventually banned from meeting with the king. And instead he had to send his emissary, Baruch, whose name means blessing and is a very cool name, Baruch. So Baruch has to deliver the messages on Jeremiah's behalf. One of the things that Jeremiah is particularly offended by, and this might come as strange to us, but this is, remember, only 2,500 years ago, was the practice of child sacrifice to a Canaanite god called Moloch. And Moloch was a god that required great painful sacrifice, chief among them child sacrifice. And Jeremiah even describes that act and says, how is it that these people can't see that they have lost their way and instead are engaging in all of these practices as if that will save them, but they're not going to God anymore. They have no relationship with God, and the king is in it for himself. These were great concerns to Jeremiah. And so in the reading we have from the Old Testament today, the first reading, Jeremiah is speaking with another prophet, Hananiah. And there's a reason you've never heard of Hananiah as a biblical prophet, because Hananiah is not a biblical prophet. Hananiah is offering a cheap grace, if we were to borrow a term from Martin Luther. A cheap grace. Hananiah is saying, it'll all work out. God loves us. It'll all work out. And Jeremiah is saying, you can't just say that and expect that things will change if the people don't change. You're offering empty platitudes on a situation that is devolving. Jeremiah says, you are crying out, peace, peace, when there is no peace. Think about that. Peace, peace, when there is no peace. Eventually, the city is destroyed, and Jeremiah's ministry ends. It never really turns around. And so we look at him as a sad story. It's a sad book, but also a book of warning of what happens when a prophet in the midst of the people calls the people to change, and the people choose not to. That is what Jesus is referring to in the gospel we hear from Matthew this morning, when he says, whoever welcomes a prophet in the name of a prophet will receive a prophet's reward. That's actually a little bit of a sting there, because the prophet's reward was never good. It's like receiving the Martyr's Award. Hey, good job, Alban. Wait a minute, I lost my head. So the prophet The prophet's reward is to say, you have done the work of the Lord and you have paid a price for it within this world. You have paid a price within your community. Matthew goes on, Jesus goes on in Matthew's gospel. This is a pickup from last week's story when he said, I have come to divide families, which is an odd thing for him to say unless you realize that what he's saying is that the message can sometimes be so hard to understand that it can even fracture the most intimate of relationships, that no intimate relationship is greater than God's intimate relationship with us. And so we're called to honor that and to lift that up. And sometimes that means to tell the people hard messages. So he's telling the disciples, will you do this? Will you go out? You may receive the prophet's reward if you do. You know, when we think about Jeremiah and Moloch, which is a particularly interesting argument or a point to the whole story, because we don't really think a whole lot about child sacrifice. But in my preparation for this homily, I was reading a commentary which compared the offering of child sacrifices and the prophets who preached against them, chiefly Jeremiah, was comparing them to the high school students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, who 2 years ago experienced an incredible tragedy. One of their own classmates opened fire and killed I think 18 of them, students and faculty. You remember this whole thing, but what was so fascinating about it was not that it happened. We have become accustomed to that. It's a national tradition for mass shootings to occur and for us to lament them and then not do anything about it and move on. But the students at that high school, they took that opportunity to speak out and to call our country to recognize what was something not too dissimilar than that which Jeremiah was prophesying, that we had become acculturated to the idea of school shootings. And they went and they spoke in the most profound of places, in Washington, and meeting with officials and this and that, and on TV, calling the nation to understand what they had committed themselves to. And how if there was no change, this would happen again. I think that's profound, in part because I was overwhelmed by the courage of those mostly 16 and 17-year-olds to go on, TV shows and meet the press and meet with officials and of both parties and stage rallies that drew almost 1 million people. I was floored by their courage. And the ability to say what happened to us, we don't want anyone to ever experience again. Well, they may not have done that work in the name of Jesus. It was Jesus's message to call the people away from their captivity of death and sin, and to recognize that this wasn't the way we were supposed to go. That makes me think of today. I am finding, as we're 4 months into this pandemic, and also coming to terms with the pandemic of racial inequity, that the question is, I'm finding two questions, and maybe you are too. One of them is, how do we solve this? But a second question I'm hearing more and more is, how much are we willing to tolerate? And that's a more troubling question, is it not? Because what we're asking ourselves is, how much death are we willing to tolerate? How much injustice are we willing to tolerate? And I think that's the question that Jeremiah is asking the people of Israel to wrestle with, and maybe Jesus as well, and maybe those students in Florida. Is this really what we want? Do we want to come to a place where we say we're okay with this amount or that amount? I was really moved recently by one of the statisticians that's done a lot of research on the pandemic, saying if everyone in this country agreed to wear a mask in social settings, then we could save 30,000 lives by October. 30,000 lives by October. But if we go on as we have, kind of some sort of half compliance, then they said that the death toll would be 30,000 higher. That's 10,000 a month. Can you imagine that? We have that capacity within us to be signs of change. And the question is, are we willing to do that? Are we willing to do that hard work? It's interesting to me to see the position of the church here on this. Our bishop has said we will not be asking the question, how much risk are we willing to tolerate? Because no amount of death within our congregations will be acceptable. To put it more bluntly, we won't reopen if it means that we lose members of our congregation. And we won't even get to a point where we'll say, well, we only lost a few. The bishop said, that's not how the church works. We're not transactional in that sense. We're not an economy that requires people to be here. We've learned we can do it this way. We can meet online. We can meet safely in small numbers outside. We can do that. We can protect every one of us. That honors the story that Jesus says when he says, I am the good shepherd. And if one of you goes missing, I will find you. I will not abandon you. But I realize that the church has never been the most perfect message of all of this. And even still, I recognize that our standing here is much influenced by a thriving economy. We have investments here too, do we not? And so I realize that Jesus is calling all of us to be a prophet and to say the difficult messages and to call people away from the relationship with death. And instead, out of compassion, say, we're meant to love each other. We're meant to care for one another. We're meant to be present for one another and strive for justice and peace and honor the dignity of every human being. Those were things we said at our baptism. They're on the wall right there. And so that's what Jesus is calling us to. But, and this is perhaps where we get a little nerdy, just to say that, that's where the sermon ended about an hour ago. But just to say that and say we're meant to be prophets sends each of us out and go, okay, well, we're meant to be prophets. We're meant to give a difficult message. I think maybe there's a baby step. And that baby step, if I may, is to identify first where we are in the relationship of the prophetic message. Because we can't be prophets if we don't realize what we've already done and how we're responding to any particular challenge in our present moment. As best I figured out, there's 4 different ways to respond to this. One is to ignore the prophetic message entirely, right? So that's to be like those early business owners in that TV show. No, I don't need to change. Nothing needs to change. Or maybe to say, oh, we're okay with a little bit of risk. We're okay with a little bit of loss because we don't want to change our habits. The second role we might take is to be the false prophet and to say, oh, it'll all work out. It'll all work out, but without us having to do anything. You see why that's a false prophecy, right? To say, oh, we don't have to change anything, but it'll all work out. Sometimes it doesn't. That's the message that Jeremiah gives. Guys, this isn't going to fix itself. We can't keep going on the path that we're going. We're going to lose the city. The third thing might be to listen to the prophecy. And that's really hard because sometimes that means that we are at odds with those around us. And maybe the fourth thing is to be the prophet. And you'll know you're being the prophet when you're giving a hard message out of compassion, out of love and in honor of God. And that message is not well received because there hasn't been a prophet who everyone has said, yes, come on in, this is great. So as we go forward, we wrestle with the world around us. Ask yourself, do it today, do it tomorrow. Who am I right now in this moment? Am I hearing any message? Am I responding to it, or am I wiping my hands of it? Or am I passing it on? Am I creating a new message? If we do that, then we'll develop prophetic muscles. I promise you, we'll develop prophetic muscles. And we'll be more accustomed to calling a world out of compassion, to change, to do so in love, and say, no, we are meant to honor every one of us. We're not meant to lose a single person, a single soul. So let us do the hard work that's required of us to change this world and to see to it that we begin the work of building the New Jerusalem, the Jerusalem city built on a hill, whose light is the light of the people. Amen.